everyone. Some of you have seen me before. I've seen some familiar faces in the room. I am a psychologist and human factors specialist and work mostly in safety critical industries, just like yours. My work is about understanding why the humans do what the humans do. And so let's get into it. I've got some ambitions for this, but who we are psychologists and ergonomists working in this safety space. What I'd like to spend some time on today, and I'm realising this is kind of ambitious, but we'll give it a run. Firstly, I just want to talk about human behaviour and how that contributes to safety or unsafety at work. How do we then integrate human factors or human performance principles into safety investigation? What is the evidence that we can use, and how do we weigh that in terms of its usefulness to us? I also want to recognise the human factors of investigation. So, spoiler alert, investigators are human too and are therefore subject to those same human performance limitations. So let's talk about some of that. And finally, a little bit of a plug for supporting investigator wellbeing. So let's start. I'm going to start with, by the end of this 10-minute session, you will understand human error, right? Oh yeah, yes. I know you've had a big night. All right, so let me start. I'm going to ask for some audience participation. I'm going to ask you to stand up if you've ever done any of these things. Come on. I see you. Okay, thank you. You may sit. Energizer activity. All right, so we've got we've got some behaviours on the screen. Some of those are in blue, some of them are in green. Can I get somebody to yell out to me, what is the fundamental difference between the blue behaviours and the green behaviours? Safety? Conscious or unconscious? Or intentional or unintentional? Yeah. Intentional or unintentional. So we've got unintentional behaviours in the green, unintentional or an error, and we've got intentional behaviours in the blue. Okay, so let me come to my next screen. What about these? I'm not going to ask anybody to stand up. But thinking about these behaviours, again, I'll ask you to call out. We've still got intentional and unintentional behaviours, but what is the difference between these behaviours and the ones that we just showed on the previous slide? All of those which we were happy to stand up and say, or most of us were happy to stand up and say, I've done those. What's the difference? They're happening in the workplace, right? So does that make them more or less likely to occur? Less likely to occur? All of them? About the same. Okay, so again, I'm going to come back to, we've got some intentional behaviours and we've got some unintentional behaviours. It is normal for humans to make errors. That is our normal performance. So our ability to control our error making does not reduce when we arrive at work. So our errors are just as likely to happen inside the gate as they are outside the gate. Intentional behaviours, are they more or less likely to occur in a work context? Thinking about the driving example, we've got driving over the speed limit on company business, or on the previous slide we had, knowingly breaking the speed limit, and let's assume that that's in our own car and in our own time. More or less likely? Less likely to occur because of? Consequence. Thank you. Somebody's done a session with me before. Okay, consequence. So our intentional behaviour, we are thinking, if I drive over the speed limit on company business, firstly, chances of me being caught are higher. Secondly, the consequence that might apply to me as an individual is more costly. So if I'm going over the speed limit in my own vehicle in my own time, what happens? Well, if I get caught, I may get a letter personally addressed to me in the mail within the next month or so. I pay a fine and I go on with my life. If I get caught going over the speed limit in my company vehicle on company time, the consequences are potentially much more significant. So that will make me less likely to intentionally do that behaviour. Consequences influence our intentional behaviour. We anticipate what might happen if I do this, and we'll regulate our own behaviour as a result. That does not work for error. So if we think about error, the behaviour is unintentional. We don't intend to do it, so we cannot anticipate the consequence of doing it and for that to then regulate. So consequences influence our intentional behaviour. So by increasing those consequences at work, we reduce the likelihood that people will intentionally go outside the rules, but that has very little impact on our error likelihood. So some basic kind of human factors assumptions or some truths about our performance. Our performance is fundamentally characterised by individual differences. So everybody in this room has differences in terms of our capacity for physical capacity, our memory, our attention, our perception, our ability to learn. Some of that is impacted by factors like gender, age, all sorts of differences. Okay, so when we are designing work for humans, we are designing for a really wide range of abilities. Humans are prone to error under certain conditions. First condition of that is being awake, right? So we are prone to error. If anyone thinks, we stood up and said we've made those errors sometime in our life, I absolutely guarantee you that every one of us has made an error this morning, whether we are aware of it or not. We catch the ones when they have a bad consequence and we find out about them, but it is normal for us to make errors. But it's not a mystery. We are aware there are conditions that will make it more likely that humans will make errors, and these are the factors that we need to build into our systems. Behaviour can be shaped and influenced, and how we design and organise our work is a major influence for that. So when we're thinking about error likelihood, we have to think about how humans process information. And so firstly, in a really nice simple model, we talk about the first thing that happens is that we take in that information from the world via our senses and through the filter of our attention. So we think about attention as a filter. We cannot attend to every bit of information that's presented to us in the world, so our attention acts as a filter. And we use our senses to take that information in. Next thing that happens is that we store that information firstly in our working memory. We make some assessments of that information about where we're going to store that in our long-term memory. We assess that in terms of its meaning for us based on our experience and our training. We make a decision based on that perception and that information in our memory, and then finally we take an action. Is that sitting like a reasonable model of information processing? So at every stage here, what we have, from my perspective, a beautiful opportunity for error at each one of those stages. So we have sensory error. There is some problem in the way that we've taken that information in from the world, so we don't see something, or we only see part of it. We can't hear something, we don't smell something. A sensory error. Next, we can have our memory error, so our failure to actually retrieve that information correctly from our memory store. We forget. We forget a step in a procedure, or we forget what we're here, or we forget what we were just going to say. Next, we can have a decision error. A decision error is an error type slightly different from the others. It's where the act that we take is intentional. We do what we intended to do, but we're doing the wrong thing, believing it to be right. Do the wrong thing, believing it to be right. So that's a judgment error. I've misdiagnosed this situation and I'm acting in the way I intend to act, but I think I'm doing the right thing. Often because of a lack of understanding or some kind of knowledge gap feeding that. We apply the wrong process, an error of judgment. And then finally, we have our action error. My best way to describe my action error, and this is our most common one, the one we're doing all of the time, is where our body betrays us. The thing that we intended to do didn't quite work out. There's some disconnect between brain and body in those last moments, and we key the wrong numbers. We say the wrong word. We walk into the wall. Nobody? Just me? Right. So what we intended to do, what our brain wanted us to do, is not what our body did in the end, which explains my lack of Olympian status, right? The things that I want my body to do just didn't quite work out. All right, so why do we go to this level of detail is so that we can understand the error in order to then determine what is the appropriate treatment. So we're doing diagnosis before treatment, just like I was taught to do. So I want to take this example. We have a car driver, while refueling their diesel car, puts petrol in the diesel tank, resulting in damage to the car. Would anyone like to have a moment to self-nominate as having been here before? Or know somebody who did it? Yeah. For a friend, okay. All right, so then what would this look like? So if this was a sensory error, this is our failure to take in that information correctly from the world. And this will be something like if the driver looked at the two similar nozzles and then mistook the petrol nozzle for the diesel nozzle. So there's been some disconnect there, and we haven't actually selected the right one. If it was a memory error, a failure to retrieve information from our memory, this might be they forgot they were driving a diesel car. So people who have a diesel vehicle and a petrol vehicle in their household go to fill up, for all sorts of reasons that might be around other distractions, preoccupations, we forget which one we're in. A decision error, again, this is do the wrong thing, believing it to be right. Lack of understanding, this is where our driver makes a decision that it's actually fine to put petrol in the diesel tank. And then if it was an action error, this is where our body betrays us. This is just if I intended to pick up the diesel nozzle and I picked up the petrol one instead. Now, again, the reason that we go into this level of detail can be the same act. We want to find out why this occurred because we want to know what is the way that I prevent this again happening in the future. So if it was a sensory error where I look at the two nozzles and mistake the petrol nozzle for the diesel nozzle, the solution might be something like actually labelling them, colour coding them, making them look very different. So we're trying to catch that error, the sensory error, before that leads to the next problem. And we have that currently at most of our fuel stations with different colours and so on. Memory error, they forgot they're driving a diesel car. How do we alert people to the fact that they're driving a diesel car? Well, currently, for those of you who drive a diesel, a little thing under your fuel cap that says, or the fuel cover that says, diesel, diesel. I really want a voice, actually. I want a voice saying, diesel, diesel, don't do it. Decision error, where we do the wrong thing, believing it to be right. So this one is about education and training for drivers, that this will cause a problem. And then finally, our action error, where we are betrayed by our body, we pick up the wrong thing, change the nozzle so the petrol nozzle doesn't actually fit diesel cars. make it really hard for the human to do the wrong thing, make it easy for them to do the right thing. Now, by the colour of my hair, you can tell that I lived in a time, actually, some of you also did, where diesel Bowser and the petrol Bowsers were dislocated from each other. This was a better arrangement for human performance, not necessarily for financial. But this was a better one for humans. So we want to understand the behaviour in order to understand what to do about it to prevent that happening again. So the next thing we look at, we've looked at error type. The next thing that we look at in human factors investigation are these things called performance shaping factors or performance influencing factors, or indeed, because we're psychs and we like to have three names for the same thing, error provoking conditions. So these are the things that are sitting in our systems that are either going to optimise or are going to degrade human performance. They help us explain what happened on the day. So my picture here on the slide is of the Venice Marathon in 2018. Anyone noticing any performance shaping factors in this image? It's Venice, right? So there's been a flood and people who were on track for their PB or something similar earlier in the race found themselves confronted by running through a lake. So they didn't quite get their performance on the day. In reading about that, on the wiki page, you'll also find that in 2017, I think the year before, performance shaping factor of one or two of the marshals directing people the wrong way. People then ended up running another extra 2 or 3 kilometres in that marathon. So that year, a local won the marathon because they knew where to go. So a performance shaping factor. Intentional or unintentional, I am not sure. So our PSF, our performance shaping factors, can make it more or less likely that people will make an error or indeed an intentional non-compliance. So those things can be internal, they can be about the person themselves, or they can be external. Our performance shaping factors are the things when we are doing a behaviour analysis or a human performance investigation. The whole concept of that is to identify these performance shaping factors so that we can go about making the fixes to our system to set our humans up for success, acknowledging the limits of human performance. So the New South Wales Resources Regulator has its own performance shaping factors framework, and that is divided into these 5 areas. Personal factors, job factors, things about the actual job, the work environment, what's happening, what kind of situation are we doing our work in, some team factors and organisational factors. So just some examples of personal factors, things like our skills, our experience, our age, our health, whether that is mental or emotional health or physical health. Things about the job itself, how complex is the job, or on the other side, how boring and monotonous is the job. Not setting your humans up for success to make them monitors, we're terrible monitors. Workstation design, ergonomics, and so on. Things about the working environment in mining, weather conditions, visibility, dust, heat, cold, vibration. In underground mining, I think we put all of those things together, right? We make it dark, we make it wet, we make it cold, sometimes vibrating. What are the things about the team that can be influencing our performance, our team communication, the quality and the quantity of direct supervision, Role clarity, how clear am I about where my job starts and stops and where my team member's job starts and stops, how those things interact. And then we also look at organisational factors, things like production culture, procurement practices that we just heard about in the last presentation, things like our fatigue risk management policy and procedures, and contractor management practices, for a few examples. So we look at, when we are thinking about what are the things that influenced this human's performance on this day, then we're going to have a look at each of those areas. And the resource regulators' performance shaping factors whole, can't even think of the word. What's that? What kind of error is that? Memory error. Okay. These are all of their performance shaping factors. You see the 5 kind of pillars there. Not expected to read these, but you'll see that there are also kind of subcategories under each of those. And our investigators at the regulator, of course, have definitions against each of those. I will come back to it. So now you understand human error? Yes. Such great interaction from this crowd, right? All right, so now we're going to move along, having a look at, all right, so what's about intentional non-compliance or violation in the old speak? What are we talking about? Intentional actions or inactions that don't conform with agreed rules or procedures, or indeed just deliberate deviations from rules or procedures or instructions or regulations. In terms of investigating human performance, we want some pretty strong evidence to support a hypothesis of intentional non-compliance. So firstly, we want to understand that that individual knew and understood the rule. Did they know and understand the rule? Did they know that that rule applies to this situation or job? And then did they decide to do it differently? It's how we're going to establish if it's intentional non-compliance. Please, not for a moment, make the mistake that we are talking about blame here. Again, we are talking about understanding why that behaviour made sense. So there may be many, many reasons why an individual worker might decide to do it differently. And sometimes that's about them, and sometimes that's about the job. So we are going to do a little activity with Slido. I want you to think about this. Why do people not always follow the rules? What are some of the reasons that people don't always follow the rules? I'm going to ask you to name one reason why people may not follow a rule at your site. Thank you. Some great insights there. So it's not seen as important, or it adds time to complete a task. People are lazy. Yes, actually, they are. We are. If we can find a way to do it quicker, we will. Saving effort and saving time are huge drivers of human innovation, right? So lots of good reasons up there. Some of them were about people. So I saw some complacency. Let me reframe that to normalisation of risk, right? So we get used to the risk. We don't see the risk as impacting us. We get a little overconfident of our own skills, so on. Sometimes the rule makes it harder to get the job done. Maybe the rule's not appropriate, it doesn't actually fit. So there are a bunch of reasons why good people, well-motivated people, and safety-conscious people might not follow the rule to the letter. Many times there is a difference between the way that the work has been designed and the way that the work gets practically done. Here's the rule, and here's how we do it. Here's how we get it done. So if I can ask you to think about types of non-compliance against this framework, we've got slips and lapses and mistakes. These are unintentional. So that is the oops, the slip or the lapse, the oops, that was not the action I intended, or I forgot, or I was not aware and I didn't understand. I actually thought I was doing the right thing. So these are unintentional. And then we've got our intentional non-compliances, starting in the middle there with our routine non-compliance. Our most common type of non-compliance is where what the rule says and how we actually get it done around here are slightly different. It is routine. Here is how we always do it around here, despite what's written down. Next level, we have organisational benefit. It's actually just better for the company to do it that way. I was trying to help the boss, or in Australia, more likely, help my mates. Personal benefit, it's quicker or better or easier for me. If I do it this way, I'll get it done quicker, I get to go home early. And at the bottom there, we've got recklessness. I didn't care about the consequences, or I knew it was wrong, but I just did it anyway. Again, while we were categorising our error types to get the right treatment, also important to categorise our intentional non-compliance so that we can respond in a way that will influence that. So you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide, our suggestion is that if we've got unintentionally not complying with the rule, the right kind of treatments are probably going to be around how do we make it easier for the human to follow that rule, by giving them job aids, training, coaching. If we've got intentional non-compliances happening for reasons, then we're probably going to want to address those reasons as well. If we recognise, again, consequence influences intentional behaviour. So down at that bottom end, around that personal benefit, and certainly, of course, at that reckless level, it is entirely appropriate that we should be responding with a disciplinary response in order to drive down that intentional non-compliance. However, coming up to the top, if we respond to error with a disciplinary response, does that make the error less likely to happen? No, because error is our normal condition. What that will drive down is the intentional behaviour associated with that error, and that is the reporting. It will drive down reporting of the error. That's the intentional behaviour that you are influencing with that consequence. If I report this, there will be a punishment. Therefore, I don't report. So errors continue to happen and we don't hear about them and have no capacity to then learn. So how we respond is important. So that diagnosis is important and how we respond is important if it is our intention to use this information to increase safety and drive down reoccurrence of these incidents and accidents. Do you have any frontline leaders in the room? I won't ask you to stand, I will ask you to raise your hand. You're a frontline leader? Leading teams of people who do the work? Yes, indeed. Okay. This is from a literature review that we did a few years ago around understanding what are the actual things that make people more likely to follow the rules. And these factors down here on the left-hand side are all found to have an independent effect on that. So first, our individual safety motivation. Am I individually, do I think safety is important and is it something that I'm going to work towards? Perceived usefulness. How useful do I see this rule as being? Is it useful to me? Or is it a hindrance? Does it make it hard for me to get the job done? How easy to use? Is the job easy to follow? If it's hard to follow, I'm much less likely to do that. Does my supervisor take a learning approach? I'm going to come back to that one. Are we involving our users, i.e. the people who do the work, in the review of processes and procedures? Are we using our subject matter experts, the ones who do the work, to include them in the discussions around how this work actually gets done and how we write our rules about it? And then finally, avoiding procedure overload. So many rules, so many forms to fill in that it's burdensome. And again, our smart, lazy humans will find a different way to do it. Now, in psychology, you will have already seen that we like to put things in boxes that don't necessarily have sharp edges. So some of these things will moderate each other. So the fastest one there we can talk about is the user involvement in review will increase our perception of how useful the rule is. If you include me in designing the rule, I like that rule now. I'm going to tell my friends about that rule. That's a good rule. However, the strongest influence then comes from our supervisor learning approach. When our supervisor takes a learning approach, we see a multiplying factor on individual safety motivation, on perceived usefulness, and ease of use. Frontline leaders have the strongest influence on employee safety compliance. Much, much stronger than the influence of whether we think our managers are committed to safety. So either worker can sit in the management brief and hear the words, "There's no job here that's so important that it can't be done safely," and we can nod and agree with that. We believe it. We can hold layered beliefs. We listen to that, we hear that message, we agree. But what we will actually do is influenced by what we believe our supervisor wants us to do. What do I believe my supervisor wants? And we take that information not just from what our supervisor says, but from what they do. Again, consequences. We are watching for what our supervisor rewards and what our supervisor doesn't reward or indeed punishes. And those things are not always explicit. We're watching for social reward. What gets praised, what doesn't get praised. So if I cut a corner and I get a pat on the back, good job, I'm watching that. I'm going to do that again. Everybody else in my team is going to do that too. Please remember that we are social creatures. Belonging and acceptance is a strong driver for human behaviour. That is a survival instinct. Please remember that we are herd animals and being in the in-group is important for our survival. So we will always be watching to how do we stay in the in-group, and our proximal leader, our frontline supervisor, has the strongest influence on that. There's a big responsibility. So I didn't actually talk about what is that learning approach, did I? The supervisor who takes the learning approach is that supervisor who, when we have a near miss or an incident or an accident, or we just have a report of an error or a non-compliance, who takes that as a learning opportunity. I've made an error, boss. Let me show you what I did. Let's take that then. Let's understand and unpack that, understand why it happened, and talk about that with our team, and maybe even share the learnings and redesign our system if we need to ensure that that doesn't happen again. So in that way, talking about errors becomes normal and becomes a learning opportunity. How do we take this as an opportunity to learn about what's happening in our system? Because if it happened to that individual, it can happen to any other individual put into those same performance shaping factors. So error is normal. It's our normal performance. So if you are designing your system dependent on perfect operator performance, then your system is unreliable, because our humans are our least reliable component in our whole system. We're also the most adaptable component, by the way, right? This is why we keep our humans in there. We keep our humans with their inconsistent performance because that is outweighed by our ability to diagnose a situation that might not have been anticipated and to come up with a novel solution. But the other side is that we are inherently inconsistent. So we have to design our systems with that in mind. Blame fixes nothing. Blaming people for bringing their humanity to work will not improve your system. When we blame people for being human, we get rid of them, we get a new human, we put them into that exact same environment with the same training and less experience, and then we get surprised when they make the same mistakes. Context drives behaviour. We know that there are conditions that make it more or less likely that errors will occur. So being aware of that and influence the context will influence the likelihood of error or non-compliance. Improving our safety systems that include a human. In order to do that, we need to learn. And in order to learn, we have to have open reporting. In order to have open reporting, we need to switch back. Blame fixes nothing. So how we respond matters. It can be really challenging because as we actually it's really nice for us to blame, certainly to blame others who are not us. I'll talk about some of those biases a bit later. But how we respond matters in terms of building that learning culture. So we as leaders have to firstly self-regulate, step back. When we hear that so-called bad news, manage our own reaction, step back and think about what is my learning opportunity here? How do we take this and learn from it to prevent that reoccurrence? All right, so how do we then, now we know all about error and we know all about intentional non-compliance, how do we integrate that into safety investigation? So for those of you who are investigators in the room, hopefully you will recognise in basic terms our traditional analysis in an investigation looks something like this at the top. First we gather our evidence, we start to assemble a sequence of events or a timeline, at which point we realise there's tons of gaps in our evidence, so we go back, we gather more evidence, and then finally we are attempting to get to a point where we can identify what are the critical factors or contributing factors or causal factors, whatever the C word that you put before factors in your methodology is, in order to then write some recommendations. Where does human and organisational analysis come into this? Where those one or more of those critical factors was a behaviour, and we want to understand why that behaviour occurred. So not every behaviour, we're not going to examine every behaviour that occurred in the incident. We're going to examine those behaviours that if they had not happened or if they had happened differently would have affected the outcome. So we do that first by defining the behaviour, identifying the existing task controls. We want to first then establish whether it was error or intentional. We'll then go a little deeper and find what type of error or non-compliance. We'll examine the performance shaping factors, determine the absent or insufficient controls, and then finally formulate some recommendations or actions to make it less likely that that behaviour will A, happen, or B, when that behaviour happens, that we will be in a position to catch that before it leads to catastrophe. When we're talking about controls for error, we're talking about prevention, detection, and recovery controls. So we'll try and eliminate the likelihood of the error as much as possible. That's never, never. But we'll also put in controls that will help us to catch it. And then if it happens, to recover. This is the question that we are asking in human and organisational factors investigation and in behaviour analysis. When you get curious like the meerkats, right? Why did that action or decision make sense to that person at that time with the information that they had, because it absolutely made sense to them. So if you find yourself as an investor saying, why did they do that? What were they thinking? That's exactly the question I want you to answer, but just without the judgment tone. Why did that make sense? It made sense to them. And if it made sense to them, it'll make sense to another human in the same context at another time. So let's understand that. Let's get curious, get inside their heads and understand why that made sense. So some of you may have seen that the regulator has been collecting this data or doing the human and organisational factors investigations since 2018. And in last year, we had the opportunity to partner with the regulator to have a look at that data set. So I want to just share just a snippet of the findings. So in July 23 last year, we looked at 267 behaviours from 267 incidents and accidents in New South Wales. So from August 2018 up until May 23. Across those 267 incidents and 267 behaviours, 180 were in surface mines and 87 were in underground mines. 197 in coal mines, 56 in large mines, metalliferous and quarries, and 14 in the small mines. That's an interesting little arrangement. Okay, of the behaviour types we identified, sensory error for surface mines in the blue, underground in the red. So you can see that we have a preponderance of error compared to intentional non-compliance for a start, sensory error, thinking error, action error. And what you'll also see is that of the intentional non-compliance, so the routine through to sabotage, that we have a whole bunch of routine non-compliances happening and very small numbers of situational and exceptional non-compliances. And what you also may note is that we had exactly 0 instances of behaviours identified as sabotage, recklessness or malicious intent. 0. So vast majority are error, and of the ones that are intentional, it is routine. That's how we do it all the time. Meaning that what we have identified here, thinking about that routine non-compliance, is that we have an issue with how work is prescribed and how work is done. There is a gap. And again, that might be for reasons, probably better known to you all than certainly to me. When we looked at mining sector, you can see that the pattern looks very much the same. Coal mines in the blue, large mines, metalliferous and quarries in the red, and small mines in the green. So regardless of operation type or of sector, the patterns were similar. So the vast majority were unintentional, and of those intentional behaviours, they were routine. And again, to emphasise, 0 sabotage behaviours. When we look at the performance shaping factors categories, tiny writing, I don't expect you to read that, human factors of presentations. Number of instances a performance shaping factor category occurred in investigations. So if you think back to that big taxonomy, that's the word I was trying to think of before, but I couldn't, of those 5 pillars, and then every one of those coming underneath. So what have we got here? We came with our category. The most common, most reported performance shaping factor category was safety management. Next was environmental conditions, then some individual non-technical factors, and then task demands. The things that are most commonly impacting people's performance on the day where their behaviour was found to contribute to an incident or accident. Now, I will say about safety management, sitting under that category, safety management, is actually a really large number of individual performance shaping factors, so that may have influenced being the top one. So one of the things that we've done since is to work with the regulator to get some more granularity on some of those factors. So there's much, much, much more in that data set, and you can find the report on the regulator's website, but just some really high-level takeaways. If we know that most of those incidents and accidents that involved human factors found that the behaviours involved were unintentional. So as investigators then, should that not be our default position? We start with an assumption, or we start with a hypothesis that the behaviour was probably unintentional, because we know that's what mostly happens. And then if you are following a hypothesis that it is intentional non-compliance, then you really want to be looking for some strong, compelling evidence to support that. Of those intentional non-compliances, we know that most of those are fitting into that routine non-compliance category. So even though we've said it's an individual decision to step outside of the rule, it's up to the organisation to manage those conditions. We know that there's a disconnect between the rule and how we're getting it done. So let's go review that and talk about why that is. Now, we know we didn't see any evidence of sabotage, negligence, recklessness or malicious intent. So can we please take our attention away from blaming individuals and looking at our systems? And what we also know is what are the things that are shaping human performance deviation in our systems here in New South Wales mining. So what we can do is that we can take that to the proactive side. We'll go, all right, well, if safety management is influencing people's error or non-compliance, let's go back in, go from the front end and see what is the error likelihood here, how can we reshape that system? We can take that and take it more proactively. Investigation is a really fantastic tool, but it is obviously reactive, and incidents and accidents are rare occurrences. But when we have a data set that tells us about what has influenced, we can use that more proactively. Okay, engineers, don't we really like some hard evidence though? Isn't this all just really subjective? Right? Isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk, have I got any lawyers in the room, by the way? So I can say whatever I want? Great. I want to talk just very briefly about standard of proof. What is the standard of proof that we use in safety investigations? So if you're not aware of the Brigginshaw principle used in legal terms, is the standard of proof required depends on the potential consequences for the accused. So that means we have different standards of proof in different types of civil or criminal cases in Australia. The first of those is this one called preponderance of the evidence. This is the one that's used in most civil proceedings. It's equivalent to on the balance of probabilities. So in most cases, this is considered generally to be, just above 50%. How likely is it to have occurred? Then we have our next one, which is clear and convincing evidence, again used in civil proceedings where greater protection against erroneous decisions is needed, where the consequences for one party are more significant. So we want stronger evidence, generally around about 66%. And then finally, we have beyond a reasonable doubt. You'll be familiar with this terminology, used in criminal proceedings where the consequences for the individual are high. We're going to apply a strong disciplinary response to an individual. Therefore, we want a higher standard of proof, generally considered to be about 90% or more. So how do we apply this to safety investigations? And I'll take you back to what is the purpose of a safety investigation. There is no or should not be an accused in a safety investigation. A safety investigation's purpose is to understand why. Why did this happen? To prevent reoccurrence. In a safety investigation, we are not seeking to apportion blame or liability. And so in most safety investigation agencies around the world, the standard of proof used is on the balance of probabilities. Or in layman's terms, what is the most likely scenario supported by the evidence here? What is most likely? We're not accusing and blaming anyone, we're understanding why it occurred. So what is the most likely scenario? We do not need beyond reasonable doubt this is absolutely what occurred in order to identify the safety lessons. So we think about what kinds of evidence that we might need for human factors. So we want to look at tangible evidence, that physical evidence that can be inspected. We've certainly got, and we rely maybe too much, on testimonial evidence, so our interviews or statements. And then we've got our accepted facts. Often, in the absence of tangible evidence or indeed any accepted facts, or let's say more so in the absence of tangible evidence, we tend to get really reliant on our interview evidence, right? Interview evidence is essentially the least reliable evidence for all of the reasons that I've been talking about in the first part of this presentation. Humans are inherently unreliable, and we come to interviews with our limitations of perception at the time of the event, our limitations of our memory retention, our memory retrieval, our exposure to other information about the event following, which corrupts our memory. So I can be sharing with you my genuine memory in that interview, but that's already been corrupted by other information that I've been exposed to. How we set up our interview, communication errors, biases of the interviewee, biases of the interviewers. Feeling very confident about interview evidence? Shouldn't be. So let me share with you this example of interview evidence. Flight AA587 in November 2001 was an American Airlines flight, regularly scheduled passenger service flying out of JFK in New York. Experienced some wake turbulence just after takeoff from an aircraft that had taken off just prior to them. The flying pilot responded to that wake turbulence just the way that they had been trained, with aggressive rudder input. The result was that the vertical stabiliser separated from the aircraft, and I can tell you lots of details in the middle, but what ended up happening, you can see in the picture, is that aircraft crashed into a residential area in Queens in New York. The crash area was across blocks and blocks and blocks. The two engines separated from the aircraft in the air and landed kilometres away from the main wreckage. How is this interesting in terms of interview evidence? There were 354 eyewitness reports. 56% of those reported that there was a fire in the fuselage. 22 reported there was no fire. 23% said there was smoke, 21 said there was no smoke. 19% reported a left bank or turn, 8% reported a right bank or turn. 79% saw downward motion. 9% saw spinning, corkscrewing or cartwheeling. 64% said parts separated. They didn't know what they were. 11% said no parts separated. Okay, so the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board in the US, interviewed some of these, or all of these. So what do you then actually do with that? What do you do with that? What you have to do with that is to firstly maximise the effectiveness of your interviews by having some really good interviewing techniques, right? So there are some ways that we interview which will help us to get better information, and there are ways that we interview which don't. And so we advocate for cognitive interviewing techniques which are designed to fit with the way that our memory works and the way that we communicate. These techniques, which I'm not going to go into detail with you today, but have been found to be 40% more effective at actually eliciting genuine memory compared to traditional interview techniques of question and answer. So this is, and some of these techniques will be very familiar to you, getting people to talk without asking questions, getting them to tell their story, and asking our questions in a way that doesn't lead or direct their thinking. Strongly advocate for interviewers to go and get some interview training. That's another conversation. The other important thing is to think about, what other evidence have I got to corroborate or even to refute the evidence that I'm getting in my interview? We need to treat our interview evidence as pretty unreliable most of the time. So we want to ensure that we are finding every other way to either refute or to confirm that evidence. So again, we're going to have our tangible evidence as well as our accepted facts. And I strongly encourage you not to just take your evidence as definite and for sure. So think about, how relevant is that? Is it direct evidence or is it circumstantial? What does this evidence actually mean? How relevant is this? Is it credible? So is this valid? So if it's testimony, your validity is questionable already. So our memory, our expertise, were they actually, when they've described to you their observations, could they actually have seen that from where they were? In my former life as an aviation investigator, reports of people describing an aircraft in the sky as being, for example, an overwing aircraft or an underwing aircraft, it is impossible for the human to determine that at that distance. So ensure that what you are hearing is actually valid and credible. And what is the relationship to other evidence? Do I have another piece of evidence which is independent to that and which is either corroborating or refuting? So we want to weigh our evidence. Please don't accept testimony evidence as the only thing and therefore real and true. So as an example, fatigue impairment, every human factors person's favourite hypothesis, have we got reasonable evidence to support a hypothesis of fatigue impairment for that individual? So in terms of tangible evidence, what are the kinds of things that we could actually use? Rosters. What were their working hours? Were they working overtime? Email and messaging timestamps. An example from my own history as a marine investigator, where we had an officer on a vessel reporting that he slept during X time, but we also saw that there were email and messaging timestamps, so we were aware that he wasn't actually asleep. Wearable technology data, if they'll give it to you. Get them to give you their Fitbit records. Also, pretty unreliable, but in a collection of evidence can be useful. Of course, things like CCTV, IVMS, other recorded data. Testimonial evidence, what we'll be asking people is about their prior sleep. We'll be using things like subjective alertness scales, validated subjective alertness scales, witness observations of fatigue, impairment related symptoms. So other people, was he yawning? Was he sleeping? Reported illnesses or disorders, and then some accepted facts from the science around human sleep requirements. Maybe we've got some validated biomathematical modelling, error prediction models. We know that humans who have had 5 hours of sleep or more are much more likely to make an error. Time, how long people have been awake, what time of day it is, how long have they been on that task. Their number of sequential night shifts are known to be highly predictive of error. And what are the error types? Error types that are associated with fatigue being memory, attention, and decision-making errors. So what we collect is a preponderance of evidence. We don't rely solely on the person saying they were tired or not tired. We try and back that up with all of that tangible evidence and the accepted facts. Again, On the balance of probabilities, does it appear likely that the person was fatigue impaired? That's what we're trying to understand in a safety investigation. Is it likely? Because remember, what we're trying to get to is, what are our safety learnings here? What's happening in our system? How do we set our human up for success or fail? If it's likely that they were fatigue impaired, then it's likely that others also will be. Come on, give me something. Okay. All right, so human factors of investigations. Some of our biases that influencing our reasoning in our investigations. So the first one, probably heard of, confirmation bias. We as humans, walking into any situation, are following a script based on our previous experiences about what this means. And we seek out information in that environment to confirm our hypothesis. We cherry pick and we confirm, and we discount information that doesn't fit with our hypothesis. So as investigators, how do we overcome confirmation bias? We deliberately seek out alternative explanations. We deliberately say, what else could explain this? What are the other possibilities? Groupthink, again, we as humans value harmony. We value belonging and acceptance above most things. So in a team, we tend to move towards agreement with one another, and that will then lead us to biased and inaccurate opinions, and certainly also overconfidence in those opinions. Much more likely in highly cohesive teams that get along really well, much more likely in where we've got members of similar backgrounds, so similar subject matter experts as we have in this room. We have a team of you all on an investigation team. It is much more likely that you'll be affected by groupthink, or where there's a lack of formal analysis procedures. How do we get past that? We add a diversity of subject matter experts onto our investigation, and we have some systematic analysis methods that encourage challenge and dissent and deliberate consideration of alternative views. Robust challenges to evidence and hypotheses. Outcome bias, where we judge a decision based on the outcome, and hindsight bias, where we, as investigators, look back at an event, knowing what happened, and we consider that that was much more predictable than it was actually at the time. Again, why did that action or decision make sense to those people at that time? A few more of my favourites. Risky shift. In any group, especially a cohesive groups that get along really well, we will tend to polarise into a more risky position than we would on our own. Halo effect. We generalise from one condition to more conditions. So the best example of halo effect is that we judge attractive people as being kinder and more intelligent than others. So we take one thing we like and we make that our assessment of their whole character and expertise. Fundamental and ultimate attribution biases. Fundamental attribution bias, we will attribute our own errors to situational factors. We will attribute errors of other people to character or personality flaw or low skill. So when you cut somebody off in traffic, it was raining, I was tired. When somebody else cuts you off in traffic, what? Right, I don't have to say it out loud. They shouldn't have a licence, they're unskilled. They shouldn't be allowed on the road because of their personality or their skill set. So we attribute our own stuff to situational factors, and others we go a little bit more blamey. Availability heuristic, we judge the likelihood of something occurring on how easy it is for us to think of examples of it happening. So investigators, police, emergency services people, our view of the world is skewed. by what we're exposed to. And planning fallacy is the one that I had to put in here because I've done it again, which is to, when we are considering how long it will take to do something or how much resources it will take to do something, we generally underestimate. So with 2 minutes to go, let me do a little plug for investigator self-care. Investigators, as I've just said, emergency services people, mines rescue people, exposed to stuff that the rest of the population is not necessarily exposed to, and thus our risk of a trauma response is increased. The strongest predictive factor for a traumatic response to an event is multiple exposure. So in my military background, we once thought that the best people to send to conflict were our hardened soldiers who'd been many, many times before. What we now know is that those people are at higher risk of having a traumatic response than people who've never been before. So multiple exposure makes you more likely to have an adverse response. We do not harden. It's a fallacy. So who can be affected by vicarious trauma, being exposed to traumatic materials, footage and so on? Relatives and friends, rescue and recovery, investigators and other vulnerable people in our organisations. So what can we do? As investigators, I strongly encourage you to do this first point here. Limit unnecessary exposure to traumatic material. So nowadays we have access to lots of footage, recordings. Think about how often, who actually needs to see what, hear what. Because every time we expose our investigators to that material or that footage, we are increasing risk of trauma. For investigators, I ask you to talk and to pay attention to your own responses and think about, am I behaving normally or am I experiencing a change? Our most predictive factor was multiple exposure. Our best protective factor is social support. So stay connected with your own support crew, your naturally occurring support crew, your friends and family and your colleagues, and ensure that you are thinking about activities that ground you. Stay well.